Let me introduce this distinguished panel. I'm just going to introduce them alphabetically, and then we'll speak in a slightly different order. Let me start with Stephanie Burgos, who's to my immediate right. She is a senior policy advisor at Oxfam America. She focuses on food security and agriculture, as well as a host of trade issues. She has brought an extensive background with her to Oxfam for such a young person. She worked for UNDP, for the IDB, and again on these kinds of questions. I believe you were active with an NGO initiative that involved the World Bank, and has done a lot of work on human rights in Central America. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in international development, in fact, from American University. And to my left is Celeste Drake from the AFLCIO. She's a trade policy specialist there, and she covers a host of issues: manufacturing, trade, global development, and so forth. She came with a distinguished career on Capitol Hill. She was the legislative director for Congresswoman Linda T. Sanchez, and before that, legislative counsel for Congressman Lloyd Doggett. She has a JD and an MPP from UCLA, won a whole host of of honors, was honored for your oral argument skills, so we'll put them to work shortly. And one of the interesting thing that certainly caught my eye, that before doing all these distinguished things, she taught world history and economics at Granite Hills High School. So, and then to her left is Jim Griff. Have I said that correctly? Griff. Who is he's the proprietor of Decision Leaders, but he really, in his heart, is a long-time trade negotiator. His career in the Foreign Service was very distinguished and very much focused on agricultural trade negotiations, really going well back to developing, I think, the early phytosanitary and sanitary standards with the WTO. He also served as head of the Food and Agriculture Service offices in both Tokyo and Germany and Berlin. Since leaving the Foreign Agricultural Service, he really has, I would say, traveled the world in sharing his knowledge of agricultural trade issues with a host of governments and a host of audience. He has a BA in International Studies and MA in Agricultural Economics from Ohio State. I was saying my father went to Ohio State, and it was the first fight song I ever learned. To my further right is Linda Megeddi. She's the vice president of the Emergency Committee for American Trade, which, as you know, is a major trade organization of some standing here in the city. The emergency to which the title refers actually started in 1969, so we're still in an emergency situation. She has a very broad portfolio that encompasses trade and investment issues, and certainly includes the TPP, and of course trade with China. Prior to joining ECAT, Ms. Megeddi was the Chief Minority Trade Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee, and served there, among other things, under the late Senator Patrick Moynihan, who was in many ways one of the founding fathers of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And you also, I believe, served as a legislative assistant to Bill Bradley. She has a BA from Penn State, a law degree from Bolt Hall, University of California, Berkeley. Well, this is really a terrific panel, and one of our number, Ms. Megeddi, has a PowerPoint, so I thought we'd pull our chairs back and start with the PowerPoint, and then we'll pull our chairs back forward again.
Okay. Thank you. Is this on? Thank you, Kent. Thank you to the Wilson Center for putting on such a magnificent program, starting with Ambassador Morantis and going through all the distinguished panelists. I feel quite honored to be here today. I would also point out that my organization, ECAT, as we're fondly known, is also secretariat to a much bigger group of companies and associations, the U.S. Business Coalition for TPP, that brings together all the major business associations, everybody from the National Association of Manufacturers and the Coalition of Service Industries to the U.S. Chamber, as well as many other companies and industries in all sectors of the U.S. economy who are looking for a high standard, ambitious, and comprehensive agreement. There's about a list of 15 principles that the TPP Coalition has put together. I think it's about 3 or 4 pages, tppcoalition.org if you want to take a look. When I think about the TPP, I always start after Hawaii, after last year's APEC Leaders Summit, with the TPP Leaders Vision Statement. Because I think for many of us in the business community, this is exactly what we're talking about, what we want to see out of these negotiations. Comprehensive, next generation, regional, model for ambition. We all heard Ambassador Morantis talk about these same things. And the objectives that the leaders of each of these countries are trying to attain, and now happily joined with Canada and Mexico formally in October, are really important things to all Americans, to businesses, to our workers, our consumers, and everyone. And you look at the benefits that they put together as part of the leaders' statement, and I think that there's all things that I would hope that we all would agree on as being important common objectives. You heard Ambassador Morantis actually go through these 5 features, and he added one more about addressing non-tariff barriers. We agree absolutely in the American business community about the need to be comprehensive, regional, cross-cutting trade issues, addressing new trade challenges, and being a living agreement. What I thought would be most useful today was to go into a little bit more depth on some of the top priorities that we're looking at in these negotiations and give a little bit of a sense of where we see things at the moment. And these are the ones I'll be talking about. Comprehensiveness. You saw it in the earlier slides if you'd read the statements from the TPP leaders. What I'd add here is that the Asia-Pacific business leaders put out a statement in Honolulu last year at the time of the Leaders Summit in APEC, and we talked about the same thing, that the Asia-Pacific business organizations all want to see a comprehensive, high standard, and ambitious TPP. What are we talking about in comprehensiveness? We're talking about all products, all sectors, no complete exclusions. And when we mean all products, we mean rules of origin that are commercially meaningful, so you don't have a product covered, but yet there is no trade in that product because the rules of origin make it so difficult for any industry to compete. We look at market access for goods, for services, and for investment. Ambassador Morantis talked about negotiating on a negative list. Absolutely. Stronger rules on SPS, although I think my colleague might be talking a lot more about that. Stronger rules on technical barriers to trade. Non-discriminatory access, and that this access should go to government procurement as well. We heard our Mexican speaker talk a little bit about some challenges or issues maybe in Mexico on that, but for I think the American business community, but I think business communities more broadly, having open, transparent, rules-based, and reciprocal government procurement markets helps everybody. It helps governments obtain goods and services in a much more cost-efficient way at a time of tight budgets, and it really opens up access to major markets around the world. So that's comprehensiveness. Investment is an area where I spend a lot of time. And hopefully maybe there'll be a program on bilateral investment treaties, Kent, and the negotiations we have with China and India and some of the other things out there, because I think that might address some of the other issues that were raised in earlier panels. What are we talking about investment? This is an issue where there's a lot of high profile, certainly on the internet and elsewhere. Non-discriminatory access. You can't discriminate against a foreign investor. Go get equity caps and other things. Basic protections. Foreign investors in the United States have a whole slew of protections from our Constitution to state constitutions and everything else. Basic due process, fair treatment with government regulatory activities. Those are the same sorts of things that U.S. companies want overseas. And then we want enforcement. We want neutral, objective, time-limited enforcement. And for investors, that means investor state. Investor state is unique to the investment world, but it's not something new or different or some special welfare program for companies. It's in nearly 3,000 agreements worldwide because investors really put themselves out. They're very different from those who just export or import. Our companies, our capital, our intellectual property, our employees are wholly subject in these foreign countries. And so we just want to make sure that they're treated fairly and that we have the right to raise issues with that government if the commitments are not met. There's a lot of issues for those of you following investment with Australia, who is now has stated that it doesn't want to do investor state, even though it has it with every other TPP partner, except New Zealand, where it has a closer economic relationship. It has it with Mexico, who's coming in. It doesn't have it with Canada. So hopefully Laura's right, and we'll have a new ally in Canada when they formally join. And we want basic rules, but there's a lot of debate about that, and we might have that this afternoon as well. Intellectual property. I don't know if any of you have seen the Department of Commerce report that came out in about March, April of this year. IP-intensive industries are critical to the success and competitiveness of the United States. Look at those numbers. It's jobs, it's exports, it's growth, it's higher wages. This should be something that we all care about getting right. Protecting our intellectual property rights overseas, protecting our inventors, our artists, our scientists. And it is also something that's not just important to the United States, it's important to all. It breeds innovation and competitiveness in countries around the world. It breeds GDP growth. It breeds jobs, and it helps ensure safety and a better quality of life. Yet, as you know, there's a lot of challenges in the IP section, a lot of critiques. Should we be protecting intellectual property rights online? What do we do about pharmaceuticals? Should we let other countries take our patented medicines and advantage their local generic industries and leave our industries and our workers without those protections? We in the American business community feel very strongly about intellectual property. Ambassador Morantis beat me to the punch. He talked about cloud computing and all these new issues out there, cross-border data flows. These are definitely the issues of the future, and it is so important that the TPP countries keep their eye on the ball on these difficult new issues out there. We don't know, we didn't expect all the advances that we've seen in the last 10 years, and who knows what the next 10 years are going to bring. This is a list of issues that are critical in this area. The first two, I would highlight cross-border data flows. I think we can do that with privacy and the needs that countries have. But companies, when they invest abroad, when they sell abroad, they need to be able to move their data. This is closely linked with concerns we've seen around the world, where countries are starting to say, well, if you're going to have an IT and information technology infrastructure, we want your server in our country. That is something that will so disadvantage any small and medium-sized enterprise. That is something that will stifle the type of e-commerce that we're seeing, as well as the cross-border investment that is so important, not just to sell goods, but for infrastructure and other forms of development as well. Another key issue is competition policy and a level playing field. Here, they're having all of the countries agree to ensure that they have a competition authority, that it's independent, that they enforce the law, promoting more open markets, a competitive landscape for consumers, and address systematic competitiveness issues. And one of the top issues there is the issue of state-owned enterprises and related issues. Supply and production chains is another big area of focus in the negotiations, something that the U.S. business community cares deeply about. And this is an issue that is really important to small and medium-sized enterprises, too, that participate in these global supply chains. We want to see a lot more work done to simplify trade, to make it easier and more cost-effective. When I was listening to Ambassador Morantis, I was thinking about one of the key issues on small and medium-sized enterprises, raising the de minimis level in the United States and all the countries so that when goods go overseas, they don't have to go through the hordes of paperwork for very little tariff payment, but things that really limit the ability of our SMEs to participate. Enforcement, obviously critical. Obviously, a state-to-state enforcement needs to be there for all commitments, investor state for the investment commitments. One of the things folks are really looking at now is a rapid response mechanism, particularly in the food and agricultural area. You have shipments, grain shipments, whatever type of shipments going to the border, another country stops it. You can't wait months or years for a state-to-state dispute settlement process to work. Your product is lost in the process. What can we do to advance that type of mechanism and really bring the TPP to a new level? A living agreement. It's both living in terms of bringing on new members. The American business community is very interested in seeing new members agree to the same basic, high-level, comprehensive type of commitments, but also to develop mechanisms to keep the work going. There's work you've heard about on regulatory coherence, work on supply chain. This work is not going to be completed overnight. There's a lot that we can bring in from what we've been doing with Canada and Mexico bilaterally, for instance, on these issues. But this is work that will need to continue, and we want to see concrete mechanisms so that this work does continue and we continue to make progress. Those are the priorities, and this is why we care about it. It's sustaining and creating American jobs. It's raising living standards, and it's improving competitiveness. Thank you.
We pull our chairs back up. Celeste, I'm going to ask you to go next, if you would.
Sure, absolutely.
Go ahead and I'll pull mine up. You want to do it here?
Sure, unless.
No, whatever you like.
For folks who are not familiar with the AFLCIO, we are the trade union confederation for the United States of America, representing over 12.5 million working families, over 50 affiliates, basically trying to cover, although I only do trade, manufacturing, globalization, all of that stuff. We cover all issues. And for us, the key questions about the TPP and all trade agreements are what rules should govern trade and who benefits. That's really what we're looking at. And Linda and I could probably do a roadshow at this point on the number of panels that we've been on. But when she talks about high standard, ambitious, next generation trade agreements, we would agree with all that. Where we disagree is when we start talking about what those terms mean specifically. When AFLCIO is talking about high standards, ambitious, next generation, we're talking about going away from the current model, which has largely substituted corporate interests for our national interests, and taking a different approach. High standards for labor, for the environment. Ambitious in terms of job creation, good job creation, protective of domestic policy space, all of those things. Things that have not really been the priority of past trade agreements. In addition to advancing domestic economic development for all of the countries involved, not just the United States, and respecting domestic policy interests in terms of environmental conservation, food safety, financial stability. We believe that trade agreements should promote fundamental labor rights and increase employment for American workers and our prospects for sustainable economic development in the future. Unfortunately, things like what impact a trade agreement like the TPP is going to have on the American job market, those aren't figured out until the trade agreement is finished. And when we ask USTR what kind of effects do you expect this to have for jobs, for labor, for wages, all of those things, what they say is basically all trade is good, all trade creates jobs. We don't need to do that study until we hand over the completed text to the ITC when it's finished. In our experience representing workers in the United States, that hasn't worked out so well. NAFTA, we were promised that we'd have a trade surplus with Mexico, that we would have potentially over 1 million new jobs. What we've seen is 700,000 jobs displaced. What we've seen is trade deficits growing. We'd like to see a new direction that really prioritizes the workers of a country and not just the share of income that's going back to capital. A trade agreement properly constructed can be a force for progress, but that requires this new and updated approach. And despite addressing new issues like state-owned enterprises, small and medium enterprises, even looking at the role of women in economies in the TPP, so far we haven't seen a whole lot else that's really a reset of past trade policy. Instead, we're seeing more of the same, and in fact, in some cases, possible doubling down on policies that we think are not good for workers. This is in terms of investment services, financial services, patent rules, government procurement, although there may be some improvements there, and the like. And what the current policy has brought us is a trade deficit of last year of about $560 billion. So we really think that it is time for a change. I'll only have time to talk about a couple of our specific issues that we're concerned about, so I'll try and do that briefly. First, we're always asked about, do you care about the labor chapter? Of course, along with all of the other chapters. And in the labor chapter, what we're looking for, the AFLCIO, in conjunction with the ITUC and the trade confederations of the vast majority of the TPP countries, developed a labor chapter, kind of largely based on the past, but going further in the directions that we've been asking for from administration after administration, incorporating the fundamental ILO conventions for labor, making sure that the enforcement mechanism really was equivalent to the state-to-state enforcement mechanism that business gets, making sure that the penalties are tied to the kinds of infractions that you're looking at, making sure that it applies to the whole economy and not just when there's a sustained or recurring infraction in a trade-affected sector. As Linda was talking about, sometimes you have a food product that is perishable where you've got a problem with an SPS and it's being kept out of the country. Likewise, when you have workers who are fired for trying to organize, that's an immediate problem. They immediately have no income, no way to buy food, no way to pay their rent. And when you have a situation like the Guatemala labor complaint under CAFTA, where that's been ongoing since 2008, there's no way, nothing that can be done at this point that's going to really remedy the problem those workers had and the problem that they were discriminated against in trying to exercise their fundamental labor rights under the laws of Guatemala, which is a very low standard under that agreement. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for when we talk about high labor standards, because if those aren't enshrined in the trade agreement, there's every incentive for large businesses to pressure developing countries not to enforce labor rights. And then in addition to having lower wages or less restrictive environmental or whatever the regulations are in that country, they can make sure that whatever's there really isn't being enforced. Another really important provision in the labor agreements, Linda talked about it, is the investment rules. The investment rules, there's been some really good work done recently on the increasing use of investment provisions. And the WTO, in fact, did a really interesting study, came out in late 2010, that talked about what businesses are really looking for based on the evidence is national treatment, making sure that they're treated the same as domestic industries. They're not looking for that investor-state dispute settlement. So they'll ask for it, but they're investing in places where that's not a guarantee. And if you look at foreign direct investment, the countries that are the biggest recipients, Brazil, India, China, they're not countries that have BITs or FTAs with the US. So the recourse there isn't to investor-state dispute settlement. And these are particularly being used by extractive industries, which is mining, gas, oil. At the end of last year, 43 of the 137 cases pending at ICSID, where it was investor-state, were extractive industries. And these are the ones that are hardest on indigenous populations. You have displacement. They're hardest on the environment. You have threats to the air, threats to the water, threats to the soil. These are things where domestic governments really do have an interest in heavily regulating and making sure that its people and its precious natural resources are protected. So whether it's a good idea to try to incentivize overseas investment, taking jobs out of the US by encouraging companies to have an extra challenge to these kind of laws is pretty questionable. Like I said, we're also interested in state-owned enterprises, government procurement, financial services, rules of origin, appropriate trading partners. We think all these choices can be made in ways that promote jobs here, promote good jobs overseas, raise up standards of living, which is what we think should be the goal of trade, and I'm happy to answer questions about that, but I'll stop there.
That's That's great. Thank you, Celeste. Jim, could we have a bit of agriculture view here? I'm saving you for last.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kent, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting program. I can see from looking around the audience that it looks like probably most of you have not had the great pleasure of working on agricultural policy. So I'm going to, in the course of this, go over a few basic points before I get into the actual TPP part. First of all, in terms of the U.S. agriculture's perspective, the first point is U.S. agriculture is not monolithic in its views about trade policy or domestic policy or anything. And that certainly applies to the TPP as well. But having said that, U.S. agriculture is very dependent on exports. This year it will be exporting in the range of $135 billion worth of agricultural products around the world. U.S. agriculture knows that it is very dependent on exports for it to thrive, for the agricultural economy to prosper. And indeed, that's what's been happening. However, on the other hand, I think it's accurate to say that over about the last decade, the enthusiasm of U.S. agriculture for the U.S. trade policy agenda has clearly been on the decline. There have been a number of factors for that. One is watching the slow and painful demise of the Doha round. It certainly has had its impact on U.S. agriculture and its views. Many in U.S. agriculture would say, frankly, that over at least the last 4 years, there has really hardly been a U.S. trade policy agenda worth supporting, and it hasn't attracted much attention from U.S. agriculture. Basically, trade policy has slipped far down the list in terms of the priorities of U.S. agriculture as far as where U.S. farm groups want to expend their political capital and their political attention. The priorities clearly are issues such as budgets for domestic production subsidy programs, and also now more and more federal energy policy, which includes now the crucial area of the federal mandate for corn-based ethanol in the production of gasoline. Now, that's been a key issue for the agricultural economy. So all of this has by far overtaken the concerns and the interest for in trade policy, although there certainly still is interest. Another basic point is the way it has evolved. Farm groups are organized basically on a sector-by-sector basis. The approach is sectoral advocacy work on behalf of U.S. agricultural interests in Washington is essentially sector-by-sector. Almost all agricultural policy issues are addressed on a sector-by-sector basis, and this certainly applies to trade policy as well. Another point is traditionally U.S. agricultural groups evaluate trade agreements or potential trade agreements by one clear parameter, and that is what will be the specific improvements in export market access into that market, not only specifically into that market, but for their particular sector, whether it's the pork producers or it's the corn growers or the fruit and vegetable producers. What will be the market access into these new markets? What will be the improvements in market access for our particular sector? And that's been the measure by which they evaluate these trade agreements. So now coming to the TPP, I would describe agriculture's perspective in this way. It has been generally supportive. Indeed, it would be politically incorrect to not be at least generally supportive. But there has not been very much enthusiasm in the support that U.S. agriculture has shown for the TPP. Remember what I just said a minute ago about looking at all this through the lens of improvements in specific market access opportunities. Let's put the new invitees, Canada and Mexico, aside for a minute. What U.S. agriculture has been looking at has been 8 other markets, 8 other countries among the 9 that have been there. Remember that among the 8, for 4 of those, the U.S. already has free trade agreements in place. So looking at the other 4, U.S. agriculture has been looking at the prospects of better access into the markets of Vietnam, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Brunei. And this has not generated a lot of excitement among U.S. agricultural exporters. Okay, saying that, now we have bigger markets, one might argue more important markets, Mexico and Canada coming into the TPP. This has also not created much of a buzz in the U.S. agricultural community. I think the reason is obvious. We do have a NAFTA. The access into the Mexican market is virtually complete for U.S. agricultural exporters, with the exception of basically of the dairy and poultry supply management and the protection that the Canadians give to that. The Canadian market has been, for the most part, open to U.S. agricultural exports. So that hasn't created a lot of enthusiasm or interest as well. There is one aspect to the TPP negotiations so far that is of quite a bit of interest to the U.S. farm groups, and that is in the area of health-related measures for agricultural imports, health-related import measures. This is referred to, you've heard the term now, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It means the ability of a government to inhibit the importation of agricultural products for the purpose of protecting the food safety or the animal health or the plant health of its people or its agriculture inside its borders. The key here is that when governments do that, it is to be based on science. There is to be a scientific rationale. Unfortunately, the history of agricultural trade is often there is not a real scientific rationale for that. The WTO has an agreement, the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. I think generally it's thought to have worked quite effectively so far. But what's happening in the TPP is there's an effort to do a so-called WTO plus in the sanitary and phytosanitary area to enhance the existing WTO disciplines. I think this is a very worthwhile effort. I think it's going to be a real challenge to make this effective on a practical basis for trade among the TPP countries, especially without having the WTO dispute settlement process to rely on. But it's certainly worth a try, and it certainly receives strong and enthusiastic support from the U.S. farm groups in terms of the effort to do that. Now, having said that, this is not just, as U.S. agriculture looks at the TPP, a matter of a win-win, and let's total up what the wins are and see if there's enough. There clearly are concerns. There clearly are what one might call defensive interest. For example, the U.S. sugar sector, which has a good bit of political clout, was able to pressure the administration when the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement was negotiated to completely exclude sugar from that agreement, meaning no additional access for Australian sugar into the U.S. market. Our sugar sector, as you would imagine, is adamant that that agreement cannot be reopened, and Australia should not receive any additional access for its sugar through the TPP process. This is a very challenging agreement for the U.S. dairy sector. The U.S. Dairy sector asserts that New Zealand uses monopolistic practices to capture a large share of the world dairy market, and the U.S. dairy groups say that they want that addressed as part of the TPP process. Laura mentioned the dairy supply management issue. This is inevitably going to be complicated and politically difficult on both sides, Canada and the U.S., in terms of Canada's approach to dairy supply management and the border measures that go with that. Clearly, the U.S. Dairy interests have expectations. I would say not necessarily that it all go away immediately, but that the TPP does move in the direction of at least significantly greater market access for U.S. dairy products into Canada. As one more example, U.S. beef exporters are not pleased with the prospect that eventually the TPP may mean, for example, that Australia will have duty-free access into the Mexican market for beef. This has been a very important market for U.S. beef exporters. If eventually Australia is also zero duty into Mexico, as is the United States currently, there is a concern that the U.S. may lose a very large share of the imported beef market in Mexico, and of course is not attracted to that prospect at all. With those various complications in defensive interests, is there anything, and a relative lack of enthusiasm, is there anything that could be done to make U.S. agriculture more enthusiastic about the TPP? I would say there is one measure that immediately would make U.S. agriculture much more enthusiastic, and that would be to bring Japan into the TPP. That would have its own implications, but as Ed and others have noted, Japan is such an affluent and relatively large market, and it's such an important market for agricultural exporters around the world that the prospect of having better access into the Japanese market would make, I think immediately would make the TPP much more attractive for U.S. agriculture. I want to end with just one broader consideration. I think that the TPP offers some really a unique challenge in terms of how to communicate about the TPP with the U.S. agricultural community. My own view is that the U.S. interest in joining the TPP and driving the TPP is inspired by very legitimate geopolitical considerations and concerns regarding the evolution of economic integration in Asia. However, I've described to you how U.S. agriculture understandably approaches trade negotiations. It thinks very specifically in terms of what's the market access, generally sector by sector, that will be gained. So I think the challenge for USTR, for this administration, whoever will be managing trade policy in the next administration, is how do you communicate with this very important sector that is U.S. agriculture? Should USTR put together the pluses and minuses in terms of agricultural market access, hope it comes out on the plus side and sell it to U.S. agriculture purely on the basis of improvements in market access? Or should it try to bring a broader view, which is clearly there, as we've heard today, in terms of the essential national interest to go with the whole agreement that is hoped to be the TPP agreement? But there's never been such a dialogue with U.S. agriculture in that context. So I think this will be a real challenge for who's ever contemplating that. So I think I'll stop there and wait for the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Stephanie, please give us a look at the NGO world.
Well, thank you very much to the Wilson Center for organizing this event and inviting Oxfam to join the panel, and thanks to all of you for sticking out to the very end. I actually have worked with both Celeste and Linda in the past on trade issues, and actually Linda and I worked closely together for a while on trade preference issues. But today on TPP, our views are going to diverge. Oxfam, as you may know, is an international development and humanitarian relief agency. We have programs in over 90 countries around the world, and we work for lasting solutions to poverty, hunger, and social injustice. We believe trade can be an engine for poverty reduction as long as the rules generate benefits for people living in poverty. To this end, broad-based development should be a core objective of U.S. trade policy. But we think TPP fails this test from what we know of negotiations to date, thanks to leaked texts, since the talks are conducted in secret and lack transparency. And I just wanted to dispute Ambassador Morantes' claim on transparency. From our perspective, for one, the full negotiating text of the Free Trade Area of the Americas was actually made public after each negotiating round. And while this administration may have set a record for holding meetings with stakeholders, we haven't really seen any real evidence that we're being heard, and the advice from anything but the standard trusted advisors is being taken into account. And we also really haven't seen a sharing of anything more than general information. Our biggest concerns from Oxfam's perspective on TPP involve intellectual property and pharmaceutical pricing provisions that will affect access to affordable medicines, and also investment provisions that will compound the problem caused by excessive intellectual property protections and limit government's ability to regulate in the public interest. While there are other issues seen as problematic, I'm going to hone in on those two this afternoon. So let me first talk about medicines issues. Why should this matter? Affordable medicines play a critical role in improving access to health care, yet 2 billion people worldwide lack access to medicines, in part because they're unaffordable. Low-cost, quality generics play a key role in improving access to medicines, especially in developing countries where resources are limited and most people pay for medicines out of pocket. There are different forms of IP, and for medicines, we're talking about patents. Patents are really a public policy instrument aimed at stimulating innovation. By providing a monopoly through a patent, governments provide an incentive for research and development in exchange for technological advancement that benefits the public. This is a balancing act that underpins patent systems everywhere. So the billion-dollar question is, when it comes to public health, which can mean saving lives, what is the right balance that governments need to strike as guardian of the public interest? For example, most people agree that taxes are necessary, but no one really claims that increasingly higher taxes are best. The same could be said about intellectual property protection. Policies that strengthen or extend monopolies on patents and related clinical trial data delay the onset of generic competition. Generic competition is really the only proven method of sustainably reducing medicine prices. So delays lead to damaging public health outcomes, namely, medicines are priced out of reach without stimulating any additional innovation. There's no acceptable balance in that scenario from a public health, development, or innovation perspective. USTR asserts it wants to get the balance right. Ambassador Marantis said so, and I was reading a blog by Ambassador Kirk on the eve of the AIDS conference saying just that as well. But they start with a flawed premise. That is that stricter intellectual property rules via trade agreements promotes pharmaceutical innovation. In fact, excessive patent protection here and in Europe can prevent public and private sector researchers from developing new therapies. And in developing countries, excessive patent protection may generate greater profits for drug companies, but it won't lead to additional innovation that meets public health needs. We know developing countries in total represent only about 15% of the global pharmaceutical demand. For TPP countries, it's about 1%. So greater intellectual property protection in developing countries doesn't alter the calculus that multinational pharmaceutical companies employ when investing their limited research and development resources. The reality is that the pharmaceutical industry itself needs to change its own business model in order to generate greater innovation. That's not something that a trade agreement can achieve. Access to affordable medicines cannot be resolved through trade agreements, but it can be made worse. And that would be the outcome if TPP includes far-reaching intellectual property rules that upset the balance between access and innovation. All TPP negotiating partners already comply with the TRIPS agreement, which includes a range of public health safeguards that were reaffirmed by the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health. Intellectual property provisions tabled by the USTR and TPP are much stricter than those in TRIPS and in any previous free trade agreement. We don't consider this higher standard to be better, as it really enables greater monopoly rights and curbs government's ability to use public health safeguards. I'll mention 4 problematic provisions and spare you a longer list. First, expanded scope of patentability allows for patenting of new forms, uses, or methods of existing products, even if there's no increase in efficacy. This technique, known as evergreening, can be used repeatedly, delaying generic competition for a long time. Second, data exclusivity creates a monopoly that's separate from patents and prohibits a country's drug regulatory authority from approving a generic medicine based on the originator company's clinical trial data. Third, patent linkage requires regulatory officials to police patents in addition to their core work of evaluating the safety and efficacy of medicines in order to prohibit marketing of a medicine if there's any patent, even a frivolous one, in effect. And fourth, patent term extensions enable patent terms beyond 20 years to compensate for administrative delays by patent offices and drug regulatory authorities. So Oxfam is particularly disturbed by the USTR's approach to the TPP because we really expected that intellectual property provisions would improve upon the so-called May 10th agreement, which was applied to the Peru, Panama, and Colombia free trade agreements. Under May 10th, patent linkage and patent term extensions were made voluntary, and important flexibilities were included in the data exclusivity provisions in order to speed up generic competition. Although May 10th did not eliminate all TRIPS Plus rules, Oxfam considered it to be a positive step in the right direction after a long time going the wrong way. It reflected a meaningful effort to ensure that U.S. trade policy more appropriately balances intellectual property protection and public health considerations. But USTR abandoned that approach, instead creating what they call an access window, which was referred to, through which the parties could opt not to apply these data exclusivity, patent linkage, and patent term extension provisions, but only under specific conditions. Those conditions are so limited, though, that the access window would not make any real positive difference for access to medicines. The access is really only in name. It's the window is just smoke and mirrors, and it's really just a bad deal for public health. From Oxfam's perspective, USTR is really engaged in a sort of doublespeak and kind of Orwellian attempt to sell greater monopoly protection as a path to improved access to medicines. Oxfam's also concerned about proposed provisions on transparency in pharmaceutical reimbursement, which would hinder government efforts to control the cost of medicines provided through public health care programs, creating a costly process where pharmaceutical companies can challenge how governments set prices. U.S. state officials warn this will negatively impact domestic efforts to manage medicine costs and could allow our trading partners to challenge cost controls used by our Veterans Health Program, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's important, actually, when taking into account that generic drugs saved U.S. consumers more than $1 trillion over the last 10 years, including nearly $200 billion last year alone, and that more savings could be achieved by increased use of generics. Intellectual property provisions also undermine U.S. efforts to improve access to health care worldwide. Thanks to cost savings from the use of generics, PEPFAR has successfully initiated treatment for over 3 million people worldwide and saved $380 million in 2010 alone. In Vietnam, where over half the population lives in poverty, 97% of antiretroviral medicines purchased under PEPFAR are generics. If Vietnam were to adopt USTR proposals, it would undermine the sustainability of HIV and AIDS treatment, as well as broader efforts by the Vietnamese government to ensure access to medicines. One thing we can agree with Ambassador Kirk in USTR is that the Obama administration has undertaken important efforts to promote health and access to medicines globally, including through PEPFAR, the Medicines Patent Pool, and the Global Health Initiative. So it's really inconceivable to us why USTR insists on TPP provisions that are incoherent with such efforts. That's just not in the public interest. It's not surprising then that USTR intellectual property proposals have generated stiff resistance from negotiating partners. It's hard to sell greater monopoly rights and less competition as facilitating access to medicines or as being compatible with free trade. If TPP is to appropriately represent America's diplomatic, development, commercial, and trade interests, Oxfam believes USTR must return to the May 10th agreement and build upon its underlying principles and objectives for access to medicines in lieu of the current negotiating text. I just want to say a few words also about investment issues, which have already been talked about, but from a development perspective, if rules regulating investments are to be consistent with the objective of promoting development, then commercial interests in expanding U.S. exports and investment opportunities need to be balanced with the broader public interest of reducing poverty and equality, as well as promoting environmental sustainability. Developing countries need tools to effectively regulate foreign investment to support their economic development. Oxfam believes that expansion of investment can and must be made compatible with protecting the public interest. The USTR proposal for the TPP, we think, fails this test. Provisions raise concern with regard to a range of public interest and development issues, including access to medicines. Since intellectual property is included in the definition of investment, the investment chapter provides an additional basis for challenging pro-health government measures. In particular, as Celeste talked a bit about, investor-state dispute settlement undermines government's ability to regulate in the public interest and for governments to promote their own national development. The mechanism enables investors, including patent holders, to directly challenge government measures before secret international tribunals, thereby circumventing the domestic judicial system, which would balance commercial interests with constitutional and human rights. Making matters worse, the vague and imprecise definitions of minimum standard of treatment and indirect expropriation enable these three-member arbitral tribunals to use broad interpretations and rulings, creating their own jurisprudence and virtually ignoring 2 centuries of state legal practice. One such tribunal recently ruled in favor of the investor in a suit brought under CAFTA, whose investment chapter is similar to what's proposed in the TPP. The Railroad Development Corporation versus Guatemala case is a fresh evidence of how the investor-state mechanism can undermine national law and government ability to take action in the public interest. It's notable that the U.S. government filed a brief before the tribunal supporting Guatemala in that case. Still, the country lost to the U.S. corporate plaintiff, whose legal strategy was incidentally crafted by the former USTR lead negotiator for CAFTA. Investor threats to file suit using these provisions can have a chilling effect too. For example, coercing governments to limit use of public health safeguards and avoid regulations that favor low-cost generics. In addition, performance requirement provisions limit legitimate measures by governments to support industrial development, including in the pharmaceuticals industry. And governments would have to implement all of these provisions through their national laws, meaning the measures would apply to investors worldwide, not just those based in TPP countries. So in conclusion, rules and trade agreements make the difference in determining whether trade will expand economic opportunity and reduce poverty in developing countries. Oxfam believes USTR proposals on intellectual property, pharmaceutical pricing, and investment would undermine development, and they're not even really necessary to expand cross-border trade. It's time for US policy to stop catering to special interests and instead enable government protection of and service in the public interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let's go quickly to questions. Again, we invite the overflow rooms. We'll start with Joe, the gentleman here near the front. And again, please identify yourself. And then the distinguished gentleman here in the front row.
My name is Joe Dukert. I happen to be a specialist in energy and environment policy, but this question has only a peripheral reference to that. Mr. Greff, is that the correct pronunciation? I was really fascinated by your offhand reference to the fact that there had never been an effort to have a serious dialogue with the agricultural sector about the importance of national interests, broad national interests. Now, I see by your bio that you are a specialist in communication, very effective. I wonder how one goes about initiating a dialogue with the agricultural sector or any of a number of sectors who might be opposed to our participation and leadership in the TPP, which may be in the national interest. It's the question presidential candidates are often asked and never answer. How?
Let's take a second question before we have an answer. Gentleman here.
First, I salute you.
Introduce yourself.
Pat Molloy. I teach international trade law at Catholic University Law School. I salute you, Kent, for the balanced program you put on here today.
Thank you.
Earlier, I asked a question about why exchange rates are not addressed in this agreement, and I would be very interested in what does labor think about doing that, and then I would ask Linda Mengeti, representing business interests, what they think about addressing exchange rates in this TPP agreement, since currency manipulation has been a problem that has plagued and created trade deficits for the United States.
Let me start with the agriculture-specific
Okay.
question, then we'll move to the broader question.
Very interesting question. I was for many years a U.S. trade negotiator from the Department of Agriculture. When you are I assume it's still true, a trade negotiator for agriculture, you know that your constituency is U.S. agriculture, U.S. agricultural producers. Those are your constituents. Consumers in general are not your constituents. What would it take to have a dialogue? We were very specific, and for example, I was part of developing the position that we had beginning of the Doha round, and it was very specifically focused on better market access and other issues like reducing domestic subsidies in Europe and so on, but all clearly so that our constituency could see the very specific benefits to them. Your question is a very important one, I think. What would it take? This is purely my own perspective. I'm not an advocate here. It would take political level leadership, and not from the Department of Agriculture, but from the White House or USTR, who had a broader view and would say, this is something, let's say, for example, the TPP has a wider objective. There are essential national interests at stake here in terms of what we want to do in Asia. As you talk to your constituents, whether your constituents are Department of Agriculture, the ag community, or Commerce Department, the industry and business, they need to understand that there are other reasons for which we're doing this. And we're going to do the best we can for them specifically, but all of these may not go the way they want them to go for U.S. sugar, for U.S. dairy. It may not all go that way because there are broader interests at stake. What that would take, I think, is the courage of good, strong political leadership. Whether we'll see that, I don't know. Your assessment would be as good as mine, but I think that's what it would take. At a higher level and outside the Department of Agriculture, outside USTR's Agriculture Division, somebody is taking a broader view and making a decision to have that dialogue with the agriculture community and others.
What about the broader currency question?
Oh, absolutely. The AFLCIO, in conjunction with many, many domestic producers, has deep concerns about currency manipulation. We think the issues with China and our almost $300 billion trade deficit with China last year are in large part, not solely, due to currency manipulation. And we've been involved in efforts to try and address that outside of specific trade agreements, so using existing countervailing duty law. That has not so far been successful. We've asked USTR multiple times in multiple ways, please include this as part of the TPP package, and particularly the geographic area that it's focused on, though not limited to, has countries that have a history of manipulating currency: China, Korea, Japan. And we know that even if a country is not manipulating currency purposefully, a sudden devaluation can undo all of the tariff reductions that you've just negotiated. So it's very, very important. And to the extent that USTR discusses it with us, they say, well, this is not an issue for a free trade agreement. This is Treasury's territory. This is sort of somebody else, not us. And what we say, well, to us it's very, very important. To many of your domestic producers, it's very, very important. We know there's a countervailing interest. There are American concerns that produce in China that are receiving great benefits from the currency manipulation, and that's part of it. But if you're going to say to workers, here's going to be a new trade agreement that we would love nothing more than to have China join, and you're going to try and build some confidence that this really is going to work to have economic growth in a way that can benefit workers and their lives and their salaries, you've got to deal with the currency issue. And so far, we don't see it in the TPP.
Stephanie, Linda, do you have any?
I do indeed. First of all, I will absolutely agree that currency valuation, whether you want to call it undervaluation, I don't personally like the word manipulation, because that raises the question that what another government is doing or not doing. Is it undervalued or not? It is a serious issue. It is particularly serious for import-sensitive industries in the United States, and so a part of the domestic industries, not everybody. As Stephanie sort of referenced, I think industries that are more export-oriented in general see that as less of a problem overall. Two, I would say that what's missing in this debate today is how much China's currency has increased in the past 12 years since Senator Schumer first put in his legislation back in 2005. I know there's different ways of valuation, and that's another big issue out there, right? Who determines what the actual undervaluation is? And if we can't, as Jeff Schott said in an earlier panel, have the IMF do it in some way, if the United States is doing it unilaterally, that raises questions. But by some reports, it's up 20, 25% or more. That doesn't mean, however, that there are not domestic industries that continue to feel the pressure. Here, we heard in Mexico, obviously Brazil has raised this, other countries. This issue is not part of the 15 core principles of the TPP Business Coalition. It has not risen to an issue that there is a general business view that this is something to tackle in a free trade agreement. And I think it is one of those issues that people need to think onward about and seriously about. But I think we sometimes run a problem that we think a trade agreement can solve every problem out there, and it cannot. And so is this really an issue that's susceptible of being in the trade area or not? Final point. Trade deficits. I've heard it several times today. I hear it every day. I should have followed Senator Moynihan's example. Every time he went to the US Senate floor and talked about trade, we brought a chart. It showed that as the trade deficit goes up, US unemployment goes down. Trade deficits are not a proxy for job loss in the United States or anywhere else. It is an important measure to look at. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. There are lots of things that we can think about, but it is not a proxy for job loss. In fact, our trade deficit has traditionally gone up when the United States has had lower unemployment because we are doing better and we have greater growth.
Stephanie, any thoughts on that?
No thoughts on
I would just,
current data.
having sinned in the past by becoming an economist, as you know, this is one of the most reviled professions in Washington,
After lawyers.
that in a standard Keynesian formula, you have exports and you have imports and then you have the net. And if you have a net deficit, that's viewed as a drain on consumption, drain on stimulus, drain on demand, and therefore that does contribute to a slower growth, and therefore there'd be a link to employment. So
All those coffee imports that
the-
we're not
the-
producing in the United States.
the other question,
yeah.
of course, the broader question is, is it bad to borrow money? And it kind of depends what you do with it. The 19th century, the United States borrowed lots of money, particularly from Europe and particularly from Great Britain, and that helped open the West, build steel mills and so forth. On the other hand, if you borrow money, you mortgage the North 40 and you have 10 years of parties, then you're in trouble. So, yes, let's take the gentleman there again. There's a gentleman on the right there, is that right? And a distinguished lady, a former panelist here in the front.
Steve Winters again. I'd like to direct this to the representative from Oxfam, Ms. Burgos, to follow up on what you were saying there. Actually, I went to a talk by the lead representative for Malaysia on the TPP for that country, and basically he said they twisted our arms on the IP. We had to give in on it, but we didn't really like it at all. But okay, so we got some other benefits out of it, so we went along with it. But we didn't like to go along with it, but we didn't have a choice, says he. And I spoke, there was a professor from Japan who's very pro-TPP, who's speaking around Japan to groups of Japanese, presenting why this is a good idea for Japan to join TPP. And he said, yes, but what they're asking me when they come to the meetings is, what's this about 70 years of copyright? This is where is this coming from? Why do we want 70 years? I mean, and he said, sorry, that's part of TPP. Well, the 70 years, of course, came because special interests in this country got our copyright extended to this 70-year period for their own particular reasons. And you argue that really these monopolies that are granted to groups for the intellectual property, the monopoly is granted not as a right from God-given right, but to the extent that it benefits the innovation in the economy. And a lot of people argue that 70 years is just out of sight. So given that basically the attitude for the people in the TPP, if you believe this Malaysian guy, is basically the U.S. is saying our way or the highway on IP. What can we, as people in this country, do to remedy the situation that you're talking about? That's the question.
So why don't we take Laura's question here?
Thank you. Laura Dawson, visitor from Canada. I wanted to delve into the issue of investor-state dispute settlement. I'm astonished that this is always spoken of as automatically curbing the right of states to regulate in the public interest. The U.S. has had investor-state protection since 1994. Are there any examples that you can give me of where this has had a chilling effect on the U.S. right to regulate in health, social policy, environmental, labor? And if I could impose on Linda to maybe give the counterfactual on how you can still regulate in the public interest despite having investor-state protections.
Let me just add and play on that one of the overflow room questions, which parallels that. In this case, they're skeptical, I think, about investor-state dispute provisions. They're saying that doesn't this create a democratic deficit and a regulatory chill? So then what's the balance of benefits from the point of view of a developing country in terms of their costs versus the arguable benefits to investors? So probably these fall to you two in particular, and I think Celeste may have a thought, and I don't know, Jim, if you jump in this at all. Why don't we start with, since Linda's name was specifically mentioned.
Okay. I think it is a gross mischaracterization to suggest that the investment rules or investor state creates any sort of regulatory chill. Over the past, I was just looking at the more recent UNCTAD statistics. These are worldwide, these some 3,000, close to 3,000 treaties. 46 cases were filed in 2011. 450 cases worldwide ever on investor state. In the United States, we have claims on expropriation, the Administrative Procedure Act, due process, numbering in the thousands, hundreds, thousands, every single year. What investor state is, what the investment rules are, if you think back to that slide, non-discrimination, basic rules of fairness. Not that governments can't regulate in the public interest, but just like in the United States, if you're going to regulate in the public interest, you're going to do so fairly and non-capriciously, or fair and equitably, as the language is. That if you expropriate, that you are going to compensate that company, individual, for that expropriation. The U.S. Text and Investment actually has the core, one of the leading U.S. Supreme Court cases on indirect expropriation, language written in there. There are provisions in our investment agreements, there are not provisions in our investment agreements that include all the black letter law that's favorable to property owners in the United States undertakings. It is the lowest common denominator right. Why do we think this is important? And we do think it is important as businesses. I represent businesses, and so the suggestion that we don't think this is important strikes me as odd. And I've just heard that the Australian business community has weighed in very loudly with their own government about how important this is. U.S. companies, and in the extractive industries, absolutely, put in hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign countries. They can, to your point, Stephanie, those foreign governments can enact whatever laws that are appropriate in their system. They can subject those U.S. investors in those countries to those laws. If we don't have recourse to these basic due process rules of the road, we have no recourse at all. We've put in money, we've put in intellectual property, we've put in all of that. I've seen claims, all the NAFTA cases about the right to regulate. You know, one of the cases, the Canadian provinces, they won a discrimination case. There's a case in Mexico where a U.S. company was going to build a water treatment facility that never got built. And a Canadian court upheld that investor state case in that claim, finding that it was contrary to these basic rules. This isn't about regulatory chill. This is about corporations just protecting basic rights. And I would also say it's not just corporations. When I look at a group like the Nature Conservancy, when they negotiate nature swap deals with foreign governments, they include an international arbitration provision in there, just like these investor state, because they understand that if they want to make sure the agreement endures and is enforceable, they need that basic rule of law.
Stephanie might have a thought on that.
I'm sure she does.
I'll say a few words about investor state, and then Celeste, you might want to follow up. So, first, I think in terms of the making a comparison to the U.S. and developing countries is not the same. The pressures that developing countries feel like they're under when a country like the U.S., and as many people said, interest in TPP is for political reasons. So feeling that there's a threat of a suit from a U.S. investor means a big difference to a country like Malaysia, Vietnam, Peru, and CAFTA countries than it does the U.S. We regularly ignore threats from retaliation from other countries. So I don't think it's a comparatively similar thing. We have the investor case suit in El Salvador right now by the Canadian mining company Pacific Rim that took advantage of setting up an office in the U.S. So that case was actually dismissed on CAFTA, but it's continuing. under El Salvador's own investment rules. So that's technically now not a case continuing under the investor state, but it's a similar type of signing up to investor state mechanism. In that case, El Salvador has been in the process of wanting to institute a law against mining. They don't have any current mining going on right now, and for environmental reasons, they're reluctant to do that. So that's a potential type of example. We also have, in the case of access to medicines, for example, there's many not related directly to investor state, but for example, the TRIPS public health safeguards that could be used by governments. They are often reluctant to do so because of the pressure they receive from other countries and from the US in particular. And this ability for investors to use this type of mechanism could be an additional incentive. It's hard to prove. I mean, it's hard to do an empirical study to show, well, to prove the negative. What hasn't happened because of this. So there are not a lot of examples to cite, certainly. But the only other thing I would say on that is that, again, from a development perspective, we believe that strengthening national judicial systems is important, and that many of these cases can and should be tried through national courts and through state-to-state mechanisms. So there's no need for an investor state mechanism, and the potential is there to do more harm than good. Let me just respond to the question on intellectual property. Entirely agree with you, except that you said that the Malaysian negotiator said that their arm was twisted and they had to give in. Well, nobody's given in yet. The negotiations are ongoing, but as far as we understand, the U.S. is pretty much alone, at least with regard to developing countries. I think Australia is unclear, but there's been pretty uniform opposition on the patents and on the pharmaceuticals access to medicines issue. I'm not directly really following the copyright issue. I think there's a number of similar arguments there, but I think medicines issue kind of stands alone. So what can we do? That's part of our frustration in hearing Ambassador Marantis talk about the openness of the negotiations, or the transparency rather. We don't, because there's been text leaked, we assume that is the text, but we still can't engage when we don't actually have the text, and then when we do, or when we think we do, and we express and put forward real, substantiated academic arguments that, World Health Organization, UNAIDS, and many others are arguing, then nothing changes. So from Oxfam's perspective, we certainly hope that developing countries will stand up for their rights. And from the US perspective on TPP, I would hope that Oxfam isn't taking position on the broader TPP, but there was many arguments about the importance of the TPP to the U.S. economy. Well, I would hope that the U.S. would see that this is not something that has to be our way or the highway. That there may be another perspective, and maybe developing countries actually should be heard, and there should be a change in their approach on this particular issue.
I just looked at my watch. I've gotten so interested in this discussion that we're way past the time that I promised. We have many more questions, both from the overflow room and I know from the audience. I just would ask you please to join me in a round of applause for a very stimulating panel.